Warm welcome to everyone at the OECD webinar, An Evidence-Informed Education, Empowering Schools and Policy Institutions Through a Culture of Research Engagement. And hello to those who are joining our YouTube live stream as well. My name is Nora Revai, and I'm leading the Strengthening the Impact of Education research project at the OECD. So why should we care about using education research? Many believe that research evidence ought to play a key role in improving student learning, making education systems more efficient and more equitable. Despite this, very few organizations and education systems have a real culture of research use in policy and practice. Our OECD project supports countries in understanding how to transform the use of education research into a vital part of policy and practice. In this effort, we are excited to announce that we recently published our new report, and my colleague Melissa will share some insights from it in a moment. After that, Jordan will discuss what using research really looks like with our three panelists. Please do get involved in the discussion. The Zoom chat is open. Just post your questions and comments, and we will try to get to as many as possible before the end of the webinar. And with that, Melissa, over to you.
If you can all see that. So I'm joined today by my team members, whose names you can see in this slide, and we'll be talking about an evidence-informed education and how we can empower schools and policy institutions through a culture of research engagement. So we're really excited, as Nora said, that we launched our second project publication recently in the summer, and we'll be sharing some of our findings with you today. And in this report, we address the question, how can we create a culture of research use in education policy and in practice? And so the report is a really rich collection of evidence of what different systems are doing to promote research use in education policy and in practice. We have several leading experts who've contributed original work. There are many in-depth case studies from different systems, and there are examples of wonderful initiatives that countries have put in place to promote research use in policy and practice. So I'll be talking about, I'll be presenting some of our findings from the policy survey, which are also included in the book. And so this policy survey was something that we conducted in 2021. This was conducted with ministries of education in 29 different countries, representing 37 systems. And as you can see, we had quite a broad geographical range of countries that participated in this survey. One thing to bear in mind throughout the upcoming slides that I'm going to present is that this represents very much the perceptions of ministries of education regarding culture of research use in their systems. So that's just something to bear in mind. So looking firstly at accessibility and relevance of education research. So how useful and accessible is education research? So of course, there is a lot of education research available in many systems, but is it actually accessible, and is it relevant to communities of policy and practice? And by accessible, we mean, is it behind paywalls, or is it open access? Is it in the right language? Is that language also accessible, and can we understand research findings in the way that they are published? Is it available in user-friendly formats, and is it relevant for the questions that policymakers and practitioners have? So looking at this particular graph, we can look at different types of education research. And this was, we asked ministries to state how they found different types of education research to be either accessible and relevant. And we can see, for instance, that secondary research is considered very relevant. So 80% of systems said it's either quite or highly relevant. It's quite accessible, so 70% is quite or highly accessible. And secondary research is mostly syntheses or reviews of existing studies on specific topics. And so what this tells us is that policymakers are quite likely to use this type of research, maybe because they find this format more user-friendly, for instance, and they find it perhaps more user-friendly than other types of research, and they find it relevant and accessible. But looking at other types of research that are also considered highly relevant, but not particularly accessible, so for example, effectiveness research, we can see that this type of research was considered highly relevant, but not particularly accessible. And this examines the effectiveness of an intervention under typical circumstances. So one thing to note is this is very much the perceptions of policymakers on whether research is relevant to them, to their communities. But this is also something actually that perhaps we need to be shaping. So if research is of a high quality, can we really say that it is relevant, for instance? So what we can also be doing is supporting ministries and education stakeholders to understand how different types of research, of education research, are actually relevant to policy and practice. And then another question that we looked at is, do we actually have a culture of research engagement in policy and practice? Can we really say that such a culture exists in ministries, in schools? So we asked ministries to the extent to which that they agree that there is a culture of research use in their systems. We looked at, for example, motivation, we looked at willingness and relationships around research use. So one reassuring finding that we found is that in many systems, policymakers and practitioners are genuinely motivated to use research. Many systems reported that this is true for both policy and practitioners. There are also genuine expectations to use education research in policy and practice, so that's also a positive finding. And a few systems also agreed that while there's an expectation to use research in policy making, they didn't necessarily think that there was much political will to do so. So that is perhaps a gap that could be addressed. We looked also at willingness to use research, and you can see from this chart that willingness to learn new methods, to learn new research skills, it's a bit lower overall than motivation. So some ministries clearly felt that policymakers and practitioners in their systems are actually a bit reluctant to apply new methods in their practice, to maybe change their methods, or perhaps they're fundamentally to reassess their existing assumptions or their practices. But actually what a strong culture of research use needs is, well, to promote critical inquiry, it must be able to challenge the status quo. So changing mindsets around research use is not necessarily easy. It will inevitably take time, it will take effort, but it's a really critical aspect of creating a culture of research use. We then looked at skills to use research. So of course, it's not possible to have a research use culture without addressing skills. And so we looked at skills around research in different systems. And we proposed 3 dimensions of skills in what we call research engagement. So firstly, looking at research literacy. So this is, for example, an individual's competence in finding, accessing, understanding, and critically evaluating research. So someone with good research literacy will have a strong understanding of research methods, for instance. We looked at research use. So this is centered on translating and applying research to specific questions, as well as communicating research to colleagues. And we looked at research production. So the extent that policymakers and and practitioners are involved in production. So of these 3 dimensions, ministries were probably the most optimistic about research literacy. So a large majority of systems felt that policymakers do have the skills to find, to understand and evaluate the quality of research. They felt that perhaps practitioners have these skills, but to a slightly lesser degree, but still overall positive about that. And the vast majority of systems also agreed that policymakers can formulate research needs and commission research based on these needs. They did, to some extent, disagree that policymakers have the skills to design or conduct research or to co-conduct research. And this is actually interesting because we know that by involving policymakers and practitioners in research production, it's a way that we can make research more relevant to policy and practice. But then there's also open questions about whether it's desirable, whether it's actually feasible for policymakers and practitioners to be really extensively involved in creating research, in producing research. So these remain open questions. And then finally, looking at resources for research use. So there simply can't be a culture of research use without adequate resources. And by resources, we mean, for example, human resources, but also financial resources, tools, and dedicated time. And then one of the human resources that we look at in our book is leadership, so strong leadership. So leaders in schools, in policy organisations, they can be role models for a research use culture, but they can also determine the availability of other resources for research use. So, for instance, leaders can help to shape organizational cultures in the work context, in workplaces. They can also ensure that there's actually time and space for policymakers or practitioners to actually use research. And what we also found is that, interestingly, many systems reported that while there is adequate soft infrastructure to use education research, there still wasn't generally enough time to use research. And so we look at the example of the healthcare sector. So we draw comparisons with another policy sector, and we found that in that sector, they have well-resourced networks, they have databases and journal subscriptions, and this enables healthcare professionals to use their time more efficiently. And so the question is this something that would be good to replicate in education? Arguably, yes, because we're quite simply not managing to reduce the burden of time on policymakers and practitioners, and as a result, they are still reporting that time is a major barrier to using research. So I'm going to extend this conversation to our panelists who are also joining us today. And we'll look at these and other questions around a culture of research engagement. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Jordan.
Thanks very much, Melissa, and hello, everybody. So we'll now move to the panel discussion section of the webinar. We've got three fantastic panelists, all representing quite diverse perspectives. So I'll ask them all to turn their cameras on if they haven't done already. Great, thank you very much. And I'll introduce you all kind of separately, and then you have a brief intervention before we turn to the Q&A section. And I would encourage anybody with a question, please post it in the chat, and we'll do our best to get around to it. Obviously, we can't promise too much within an hour, but we'll see how we get on. So our first panelist is Professor Montserrat Tortosa. Montserrat is currently an educational consultant at the Department of Education in Catalonia. Previous to this, she worked as a teacher of physics and chemistry in secondary schools in Catalonia, and she's also a researcher on didactics and has been an associate lecturer at 2 universities, as well as participating in 17 research projects at international, national, and local level. She's published over 60 scientific publications and is frequently presenting at conferences. So one of the lessons that has been highlighted by the research that Melissa's presented and other research as well is the importance of having an overall strategy to make sure there's accessible and relevant research for policymakers and practitioners' needs. So Montserrat, Catalonia has recently engaged in developing a plan to strengthen the use of education research. Could you please tell us a bit more about this?
Yes, thank you very much, Jordan. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. Is it a big honor for me to discuss the Catalan Education Research Plan with you? I've seen that there's people from all over the world, so this plan is being developed now in Catalonia, which is a small region in the south of Europe, just to bring you situated. Catalonia has full competences in education. So what motivated us to start the Catalan Education Research Plan? The main motivation, that's the driving force, is to have a society that's inclusive and that's equitable and that's fair. And to have this, we need an educational system that where no one is left behind. And all individuals have access to learning opportunities during all their lives. And what happens is that, unfortunately, currently we don't have this. The Education Research Plan of Catalonia is in line with recommendation of international organizations such as UNESCO or OECD, and it emphasizes the incorporation of scientific evidence to enhance educational systems and to address educational challenges. Moreover, it is also in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. What happens is that to create a research plan that is useful and is effective is a complex challenge that requires the involvement of many different stakeholders. Who is developing the plan? In order to ensure the participation of all stakeholders in education and in research, this plan is a collaborative effort between two departments of the Catalan government. That's the Department of Education and the Department of Research and Universities. A formal agreement between these two departments was established in March of this year, in March 2023, and the two departments expressed their commitment to develop and also to allocate resources to the educational research plan. Which are the main objectives of the plan? Well, to start working in the plan, we started 2 years ago, so in 2021, with two main objectives. One objective devoted to practitioners in education, and the other objective was related to governmental institutions. So one objective is to support educational practices, obviously mainly in schools with evidence, while the other is to inform decision-making in educational policy within our country. Which are the steps to develop this plan? So its development consists on 3 phases. The first phase is a diagnosis plan. It is previous to writing the plan itself, and it was finished and presented last March 2023. The second phase involves a public consultation with all stakeholders, and it is scheduled as a convention next November 2023. And finally, having all these inputs, then the plan itself will be written. To elaborate a bit more on the first phase, that's the diagnosis. The diagnosis was conducted by a researcher, an expert researcher, and it had the technical support of both departments of the government who are involved in the plan. Which kind of information gave the diagnosis that now is currently finished? It gave us 2 kinds of information to know the state of the art of educational research. So on one hand, it gave us information on what research is done now in Catalonia, which are the topics that are researched, which are the topics that are not yet researched, which are to have all this data, to have a map on the research in Catalonia. And on the other hand, the diagnosis also gave us a qualitative analysis of 100 of interviews with relevant personalities from research and from education. Sorry, I am in a sustainable building and the light is off. Okay, thank you. So as a result of this diagnosis, a set of 15 future challenges were proposed. And these 15 future challenges can be grouped can be categorized in 4 strategic areas. These 4 strategic areas are: one is the promotion of research in education. Another area is the transfer of research. Working with data is another one. And the evaluation of educational policies and programs. I will now provide some examples, very quick. If you want more information, then later in the discussion, perhaps I can explain more, but some examples. For example, now currently, there is an open call for educational research proposals in Catalonia. So research groups can submit proposals. In fact, the deadline is tomorrow, 21st. And is specific for educational research in Catalonia. It is the first time, because previously such specific calls didn't exist in our country, at least. So this is, of course, related to researchers. But another example on how to promote research in education is devoted to schools. So a pedagogical innovation program based on research has been designed. I know this because I personally coordinate from the Department of Education this program, and this program is intended for schools. So there was an open call for schools, and 12 schools in the pilot phase were selected through this public call, and they appointed a team of teacher researchers in their school, and they submitted a preliminary project where they aimed to improve a specific aspect of their school.
Just quickly, we need
yes.
to stick to time. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So just to say that the next, well, these are two examples, one related to researchers and another one to schools. And now the next immediate step is to conduct a public consultation. And thank you for your attention. I look forward to insightful discussions after the other panelists have their time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I especially like the beginning of the society perspective. I think it's really important to remember, why we're all here doing what we do. So thank you very much for that. I had a follow-up question, but you kind of already answered it anyway. So if that's okay, I'll skip to our next panelist and save the follow-up question for later. So our next panelist is Dr. Matthijs Vandenberg. Matthijs is the director of the research department at the Dutch Inspectorate of Education. This department is concerned with monitoring statistics, data analysis, scientific systemic research, and the evaluation program of the Dutch Inspectorate. The department reports yearly about the state of education in the Netherlands, outlining developments and key themes in Dutch education. As you will have seen, our data suggests that policymakers and teachers are not necessarily willing to challenge their existing assumptions in light of research. I think this has come out in other pieces of research as well. It also shows that they don't necessarily have the right skills to do so, even if they wanted to. So I was wondering, how do you see this from the perspective of the inspectorate? And what does your inspectorate do to support a culture of research engagement in schools and policymaking? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jordan, for this kind introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I'm feeling honored, and it's a real pleasure to join the discussion. And I would also like to compliment you on your work on strengthening the impact of education research. I found the recent publication very interesting, and I look forward to the next steps of it. So regarding to your question, Jordan, I think it's good for the audience to take notice of the specific situation of the Dutch educational system and the bounded role of the Dutch Inspectorate of Education. Because the Netherlands is the only country in the world, to my knowledge, with constitutional freedom of education. Our constitution says all persons shall be free to provide education. And this means that everyone can start a school based on any kind of concept or philosophy or religion, as long as they comply to the education laws. And these laws are rather general. They only contain basic requirements, like concerning reference levels, etc. So there's no law stating that schools need to have a research engaged culture or an obligation to use evidence or evidence informed approaches. So the Dutch Inspectorate is bounded to enforcement of these basic laws. So there we have only a limited mandate, aiming at enforcing only the legal requirements. So at the school level, we have no mandate in facilitating that culture of research engagement. However, I'm an optimist. We seem to notice in our country a shift towards using more evidence-based methods in education. For instance, our parliament recently adopted a statement that the educational field should not use didactical concepts that are not evidence-based, and the inspectorate must incorporate this in their research framework. So this is an indication that, well, times are changing in my view, and ultimately this will lead to new laws in our country, and that will give us more ground to reinforcement in the field of evidence-informed education. But having said that, our inspectorate, fortunately, also have a second main task. Besides the enforcement supervision at the school level, we also have been given the task to stimulate the quality of education in the system. This is our so-called reflective role. And there we have much more opportunities to stimulate this evidence-informed culture. So we have at our inspectorate, we have a large research program in which we systematically monitor and study different aspects of the education system. And based on the findings of this research, we also formulate recommendations to policy, for instance, to improve. And to my opinion, our recommendations are taken very seriously, both in policy and in the working field. To give you an example, we found that the levels of basic skills were going down in our country year after year, and we reported about this in our annual State of Education. You mentioned it. And so we created urgency on real action here. And well, we believe that this is, well, one of the incentives for the Dutch policymakers to start a comprehensive master plan on improving these basic skills. So this is an example of how we contribute to this learning culture in education. And if I have a few minutes, I also want to give another example. Because it's an interesting field, I think. We developed a teaching quality monitor, and we measure whether aspects of effective teaching are observed in Dutch schools. And the instrument we use is based on what we know about effective teaching. And in this way, we stimulate schools and teachers to use the results and improve their teaching based on our findings. And this is also an example of stimulating research-based culture in schools based on our reflective role. And finally, there's also a new initiative in the Netherlands. It is called Power to Develop, Ontwikkelkracht in Dutch. And this initiative is aimed to help schools to translate education research into practical material that schools can use to improve teaching quality, to strengthen student development and their own craftsmanship by connecting educational practice with insights from research. And it is precisely that combination that leads to impact in the classroom. And so coming back to your question, Jordan, yes, as an inspectorate, we do support a culture of research engagement in education, both at school level and at the policy level. And I tried to illustrate that we do this in several ways, trying to be effective in our specific context we work. And I believe we really make impact in this way. So back to you, Jordan.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear all the work that's been being done, and also thanks for reminding us of the importance of system context as well when adapting these different mechanisms. So I just had a quick follow-up question. I think we're doing okay for time, but just keep your answer fairly brief if that's possible. Perhaps a bit of a provocative one, but so do you think practitioners or policymakers are the harder group to target when it comes to developing a culture of research use?
That is a real tricky question. Well, policymakers, for sure, are the harder target group. And of course, policymakers usually are academics and they understand science very well. However, policymakers have a short time horizon. They want quick and clear results, preferably to underpin the policy choices. So sometimes, to be honest, to me, it seems that they rather want policy-based evidence than evidence-based policy. So I think well, in the past, practitioners were more rejective concerning evidence-informed education, valuing their freedom and autonomy and their craftsmanship. But I see that in the recent years, more and more this changes, and there's more willingness to work evidence-informed within education. And we see several bottom-up initiatives in our country, like Ontwikkelkracht, both aiming to connect practice and research. So I think policymakers are the harder target group, and but I'm an optimist, and I see changes in both target groups.
Thank you very much. So we'll now turn to our final panelist, Kathy. So Professor Kathy Burnett is a professor of literacy and education at Sheffield Institute of Education at Sheffield Hallam University in the United Kingdom. She has extensive experience facilitating teachers' engagement with research through teacher education, professional learning, and research projects, and is currently leading the Economic and Social Research Council funded project, Research Mobilities in Primary Literacy Education. This project explores how literacy moves to, around, and among primary teachers in England. So, Kathy, we've seen that practitioners and researchers often don't have the same understanding of what research is and how it can be used. And of course, using research is not a straightforward and direct process. So could you please tell us a bit more about how teachers actually engage with research in real life and how you would describe the interaction between research and professional knowledge?
Yeah, certainly. I'd also like to thank you for asking me to be part of this. It's such a useful and important conversation. Thank you. And so interesting to listen to the other two speakers. My input is going to turn around a little bit to focus on all of this from the teacher's perspective. And I'm very aware that what I'm talking about is very much placed in the context of England, which may be distinctive in a number of ways. So I want to say a little bit about this experience of coming across research in their everyday professional lives, based on the current project that I'm involved in. And as part of this, we've talked to primary teachers in England about their encounters with literacy research. And by encounters, I mean any occasion where they've come across, engaged with research in any way, whether that's driven by their own interests or whether it's or natural policy. So a couple of noteworthy things that we have noticed. One is the huge, many of these won't be a surprise, but they are worth noting, I think, in this context. The first is that teachers encounter research through a huge variety of channels, obviously through school and policy initiatives, but also through networks, associations, social media, email lists. And we see this kind of rapid flow of information and ideas across local, regional, sometimes national boundaries. Some of this comes from universities, but mostly not. Mostly from a wide range of brokers who are interpreting and repackaging research for teachers in different ways. Some of you will know the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK, so some from there, but also from professional associations, lobby groups, colleagues, social media, and to a great extent, independent consultants. So we have a wide diversity of individuals and organisations with a range of different academic and political and commercial and ideological interests. And that research comes in different forms. So some of it might be embedded within a training session, but it might be a tweet or a blog post or a conversation. And because of that, it can be very difficult to trace whether or not what they encounter actually has any roots in research at all. And if it does, what remains of the original research once it's distilled into a few words or bullet points or an infograph or whatever. So we're interested in the way that whatever is done strategically to facilitate engagement with research, in the wild, if you like, teachers might be encountering research through multiple channels via multiple brokers in a wide variety of forms. And we're interested in what this feels like to teachers. And so we did ask teachers to visualise what this felt like. And just to share a couple of examples, one teacher presented us with a drawing of themselves in bed on a weekend morning, and around themselves were a PowerPoint and a tweet and a laptop and a PDF, and they were kind of trying to say that it's the only opportunity they have to engage with research is those weekend mornings, the only quiet time they have, even though they find that very valuable, the only time they have. Another teacher presented us with an image of a waterfall, and she described this cascade of information that was coming down to her, which was hugely powerful, but also overpowering in many ways. So if you hold those two images in your mind, it's interesting then to think about how teachers navigate all of this and what this actually means for professional knowledge. And something interesting, first of all, to say about how teachers are judging credibility of research and the brokers who are mediating research, actually. Sometimes the teachers that we spoke to do that through fairly conventional means, through evaluating academic credentials or whatever, but often it's more about the feel of the person, or often because the research keeps on cropping up in different places, it starts to feel like it's something that they should be concerned with. So my first point really is that judgments about credibility are quite difficult and complex and challenging. And then the second point I wanted to make about this was that this massive diversification of channels and brokers seems to be associated with a narrowing of the topics that individual teachers are engaging with. And we could give lots of reasons why this might be the case, linked to national and local policy, commercial factors, popular discourse, the work of algorithms, but it is noteworthy, we think. So just to summarise then, teachers may be encountering research in lots of different forms through a wide range of channels and brokers, but counterintuitively, they may be engaging with quite a narrow range of topics and questions that can map neatly onto existing practice. And if that's the case, that feels important because it may suggest that a use of research to inform professional knowledge that is more about, that becomes more about something about sustaining the status quo than imagining what else might be possible, or indeed what else might be necessary for teaching now and in the future. So I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. Again, another really interesting intervention. It's also really good to highlight the kind of lived experience, you know, which is so important when we're talking about research engagement culture, or any kind of culture, really. So just a quick follow-up question. What kind of skills and knowledge do teachers actually need to be able to engage with research thoughtfully, and how can professional learning help to develop these skills? Do all teachers even need such skills, do you think?
Yeah, really interesting set of questions. And we started, didn't we, with the list of skills that you'd already kind of pulled out, which I think is a really useful starting point. The thing that I would like, well, not a starting point, ambition perhaps is a better word. The thing I'd like to highlight really is the notion of critical reflective engagement. And I think in this complex context, really, contemporary context of research engagement, we need to be thinking and looking about that again, and thinking about how that involves thoughts about how research looks very different according to methodology. How do we engage critically with research that appears in multiple forms and which moves in different ways? So there's various skills and understanding embedded within that, I think, linked to locating and evaluating research, but also to understanding the contribution of different kinds of research and developing different ways of interrogating research. If we're going to do that, and I think we do need to explore that with all teachers, I think. I might want to say more about that later, but I think we do. A key thing to promote professional learning from our discussions and previous work with teachers is creating non-judgmental spaces for teachers to reflect on research findings in collaboration with colleagues. This is what teachers are talking about as being most valuable. So going back to the image of a waterfall, thinking about what can be done to slow the flow, if you like, and provide professional learning opportunities that give teachers time and space to think about and with research in ways that are really meaningful to professional practice. and that enhance teachers' sense of their own professional agency, not just as users, but as makers and as interpreters of research.
Great, thank you. And I can see some nodding from the other panelists, so it seems like a good moment to jump into the panel discussion with the Q&A. So thanks very much to all of the attendees who've sent in questions. We've tried to kind of sort through them as best we can. I've got one that I think would be good for all panelists, so please just jump in, anyone who wants to have a first go. So Jana, I'm not sure which country you're from, apologies, says, in my view, to enable teachers to use education research effectively, we need intermediaries who process the research. So really the question is, what types of organizations should have this role, and what do effective intermediary activities look like? Who wants to jump in with this one? Otherwise, I'll pick somebody. Okay, Montserrat, perhaps? Yep.
Well, okay, it's true that if a teacher doesn't have a background in education, it's difficult for a teacher to use it. But if the teacher has something like a company or a person who coaches him or her, then it can have good research. So now I will explain a bit more. For example, some programs of action research, like the one I started before to explain, in which teachers at the schools will have a coach, which is an in-service teacher with a background of research, an external coach, who will go to school and will help teachers to start to make their own research. So I think this is a kind of way, like the question that has been asked, a way of interpreting research. Sometimes it's difficult even for teachers to make a good question research. They know there is a problem, but they don't know which is the question researcher. So it is needed, as the question was asked, a kind of translation on how to do research. So
thanks very much. Would anybody else like to jump in? Kathy?
I could just carry on really from the point I was making earlier, really about providing different spaces where teachers can speak to one another. And I think facilitating those sorts of really productive conversations between teachers and giving teachers space and supported space, really, and permission to share questions, explore examples or fragments of research together, I think is really useful. And I think effective facilitation of those spaces is a really useful function of various different other organisations.
Great, thank you. Final word, Matthias?
Well, very short. I was thinking about intermediates in a way like intermediate functions that provide summaries and reviews and translations, etc., and facilitating the translation from evidence to your own context. And I think there's a real need for those types of functions. And I also think there's need of very good meta-analysis that summarize the existing body of knowledge of a certain theme and make it accessible easily. So that can help a lot, I think.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so I'll just try and very quickly to put some of them together. We have a couple more questions about teacher skills and teacher education. So I'll just kind of push one together. So is it how do we help teachers to maintain a disposition toward learning and growing in their teaching practice? Would anybody like to jump in?
It should be recognized.
Mm-hmm.
They need some help or some recognition. But this happens for in teachers, and it also happens in researchers. Researchers mainly are recognized for their publications, but usually they don't have recognition for the transfer of research. So perhaps groups of teachers, which was the question, should be recognized, should have a better recognition. This is the answer, the complete answer to the question from my part.
Thank you very much. That kind of brings us on to another question that was posed by Mandy Duncan in the United Kingdom. So how can universities best engage with their local schools to support research needs?
And I think there are lots of examples of university local networks, and I think there's lots of sort of really productive work going on there, both in providing forums for teachers and schools to share their own research and inquiry, and also for universities to share theirs, but also to engage in really productive dialogues about the sort of questions that are important. One of the things I've been thinking about recently, though, is that I think in universities we tend to have fallen back on quite traditional ways of sharing research, for example, through articles or extracts from articles or summaries. And I'm wondering whether there's work to be done there in being a little bit more creative and, dare I say, playful in thinking about how we share research and discuss research between universities and schools.
Yes, I agree with that, and I would like to add that in my view, academics really need to come out of their buildings and to create and build local networks with practitioners. So to develop a practice-based research agenda, and I think it's really needed that this mindset should be shifted to a more practice-based research agenda and real co-creation with those who do the work, I think. So that's what I would like to add to this question.
It's a really important point. Montserrat, would you like to jump in, or should I have other questions as well? It's up to you.
No, I agree. I agree with Mattis or with Kathy what they say, but it's not easy for university professors to make this jumping because but it should be, it should change because they are mainly, Kathy, you know better than me, they are mainly valued by their papers, is it? So they should also not only in education but also in other fields. Researchers should be recognized also by the transfer of their research. And in the case of research in education, this transfer goes to schools, from university researchers to schools.
So that
I totally agree with Monse that academics, they need to be valued not only by their scientific impact or their scientific work, but also by their societal impacts. I think it's a very important point.
Yeah, we've had a few questions which relate to this as well. Lisa Marie Muller asked how we can best recognize and share collective teacher expertise so that it really complements academic research evidence. Any thoughts on how we can really value and recognize teacher expertise? Kathy, go ahead.
I can sort of share some examples of things where I think that's been very successfully done. So there's a number of conferences in my field in literacy education which combine researchers and teachers sharing research in those different places, and which value and award, if you like, successful teacher research. But I'm also thinking about an example from the Open University within the UK, so a body of work around reading for pleasure led by Professor Teresa Kremen at the OU, which has just been hugely successful both in providing platforms both for sharing academic research, but sharing it alongside teachers' examples and experiences of practice. and also examples of teacher inquiry. And I think finding spaces where those things sit together, rather than what I think has traditionally happened, where academics publish somewhere and then teachers may well occasionally publish somewhere else, but finding those shared spaces seem to be really productive for opening up that dialogue, I think.
Can I add something?
Mm-hmm.
I think that apart from what Kathy says, a good way of recognizing teachers is that to having this competence in research is good for their professional development. And now this doesn't happen, at least currently, for what I know, at least in my country.
Any comment, Matthias? No? Well, that kind of brings us on to the wider systemic system level question, actually, quite neatly. So we've had a couple of questions relating to that. So Martin Henry asks, obviously we heard from Melissa about time and how that's seen as a barrier. So how do we provide time for teachers to carry out research? And what are the successful mechanisms for doing this? And if I can just broaden it up, actually, beyond just conducting research and also just to engage with research, how do we find this time? Montserrat?
Yes, there have been some researchers that say that teachers spend much time in general in administrative tasks. So perhaps time should be reorganized in order that the teachers don't have as much work, paperwork, administrative, and somehow they could be engaged in research. This is general, but the other way is to get involved in projects, for example, with university researchers or other kinds that are in research. But of course, it's a good question. Usually teachers don't have much time. It's true.
Any other comments on that?
Yes, well, I agree with this point, and it's I think it's not an easy one because, well, in the Netherlands, but also I know in other countries there's a large teacher shortage, and we need every time we have in the classroom. So how to provide this time, and I only can say that in the Netherlands we see that there is, well, quite a lot of professionalization time for teachers relatively to other countries, but this time is not always spent that effective or most effective. So maybe there's an opportunity in using that development time more effectively. And in the Netherlands, there's relatively well, I think there's space to improve in our country regarding that development time. But it's a very difficult one. I agree.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and absolutely that time is a critical issue. I think there is another question for me about how policies around research engagement intersect with other policies, and perhaps there's something about looking holistically at the different demands that different policy initiatives place on teachers, and how other expectations. Perhaps we need to look at education more in the round. I think isolating research or inquiry, or as somebody's just put in the chat, inquisitive professionalism, I think it never sits on its own. It always happens in relation to what else is going on in terms of policy.
Thanks very much. So just looking at the questions who've been sent in, just bear with me 1 second. We have a question, and I'm not sure who wants to answer this, but we have a couple of questions actually about the role of government researchers. So obviously in the public administration, there are many researchers working to facilitate research use. I was wondering how any of you see the role of government researchers who are conducting their own research, and perhaps the role of like independent researchers who may be working with the government with regards to facilitating a culture of research use. Yeah, I hope that's clear. Sorry.
So I think it's good that in policy, for instance, the educational department also have researchers inside the department, so they know and they feel what it is to do to perform research and to interpret results. So I think that's a positive, and also working with the government and academia together. And of course, you should make very good appointments together about, well, how you conduct research and about the independentness of the research. But I think with a good context and good settings, it's very fruitful. It can be very fruitful.
Thanks very much. Any reactions to that?
I think.
Oh, no, you go.
Go ahead, Montserrat.
No, I think it's good that there are some organizations like Research Institute that belong to the government that gather data and research that sociological data on education. I think it is good to know so that decisions are informed on research, not on answers.
Thanks very much, Kathy.
Yeah, it's a sort of related point, really. I think it's really interesting to look at research done by different groups of people, and we have a lot of research done by charities and other forms of organisations. I suppose my interest really is in how those things combine and the intersection between them. And I think, again, to follow my earlier theme, looking for opportunities to dialogue, ensuring that there is really dialogue between research done by people in different kinds of organisations, I think can be really, really productive, bring those different perspectives and points of view together.
Thank you very much indeed. We have just a couple of minutes left, so I do have a kind of closing question, and then we'll have to draw the webinar to a close. So thank you very much for all your contributions. My closing question, I would ask you to keep it to just 15 seconds if possible. If you had a recommendation to your chosen target group, this could be teachers, it could be school leaders, ministries of education, or others, what would be your single most important recommendation to facilitate research engagement in policy or practice? Who wants to be first? Very, very quickly.
Well, I would like to start, if it's okay. I think we need to make stronger efforts to measure and monitor and evaluate the impact of all kinds of initiatives. So knowing what works and what works, and I think this webinar and your publications, etc., can help here. And I would recommend to keep on doing this.
Thanks very much, Kathy.
Yeah, I think I'm going to stick with my theme for this afternoon, which is to create structures and frameworks that allow space and time for professional dialogue with and around research.
Thank you very much. Montserrat, final word?
Well, I think that it's good to promote strategic leadership that promotes research and engagement and collaboration among different stakeholders. And this means to have recognition for them, for researchers and for teachers. And this means to put resources on it.
Perfect. Very good to end on leadership as well. A topic of a whole nother webinar, I can imagine. So thank you very much to our panelists. It was a fascinating discussion. Please, the audience, stay tuned to follow the Strengthening the Impact of Education research project. We have new outputs on knowledge mobilization and activities and their effectiveness coming in 2024. Please also continue to follow the EduPublic webinars. The next one, I think, will coincide with World Teachers' Day, which is at the beginning of October. So I think we are more or less done. So thank you very much to all panelists and my colleagues and the audience.
Thank you.